Let's break this down, shall we? 1. Does the Bible condone slavery? Alan's opening argument is essentially but the Bible doesn't really condone slavery defense. Kind of like when your friend eats a whole pizza by themselves and says, I didn't really eat the whole pizza, just like half of it in spirit. Sure, Alan, slavery isn't ideal, but let's throw in a few laws to make sure it's regulated, right? God's way of saying, slavery? Nah, just put some rules on it and maybe a freebie after 6 years. Very progressive. But the Bible doesn't really condone beating slaves. The Exodus 21 passage about corporal punishment of slaves, classic misinterpretation. Alan claims it's all about fairness and God just knows people are going to beat each other, so he thought, let's at least make sure it's not fatal. Ah, yes, that's exactly what I want to hear from my supreme deity. Just don't kill them, okay? It's the kind of parental wisdom we get when your mom says, you can't have cake, but you can have the crumbs. Thanks, Mom, that really clears things up. 3. But the slaves had rights. Yes, some slaves had rights. After all, there's a 6-year time limit, and if they had an eye or tooth knocked out, they were free to go. What an amazing human rights policy. An eye for an eye, but make it literal. Forget healthcare or workers' compensation, just poke out your slave's eye and poof, freedom. Meanwhile, in modern times, we have actual labor laws and protections. Progress, right? 4. But slavery back then was different. Let's talk about how slavery in the Old Testament was supposedly so much more dignified than the kind we saw in the US. Apparently, you could voluntarily enslave yourself to pay off debt. But of course, Alan doesn't mention that this was more of a last resort than a fun holiday package. Picture this, you're drowning in debt and your best option is working for your neighbor as their slave. How utterly charming. I bet that debt relief program looked so much better than filing for bankruptcy. 5. But Jesus never endorsed slave beating. Ah yes, Alan saves the best for last. The parable in Luke 12:47-48. Jesus is apparently talking about punishing people who didn't get the gospel memo, so naturally, Alan jumps to the conclusion that it's about slaves. Hey, if they don't do what they're supposed to, a little beatdown is fine, right? Classic Jesus logic. I'm sure this is exactly what Jesus meant when he said, love thy neighbor, just as long as that neighbor isn't disobedient. The final verdict. Alan Parr is trying to spin this whole slavery thing into a nice, neat bow, but he's basically saying, sure, slavery exists, but don't worry, we've got some rules for it. If the Bible is meant to be a moral guide, maybe a little more than 6-year debt servitude and let's not kill your slaves is in order, don't you think? So, let's just call this what it is, a morally questionable, ethically dicey, and absolutely ancient system of slavery dressed up with some divine guidelines. Because obviously, a good God would want to make sure his slaves had adequate working conditions, but wouldn't want to abolish the whole thing. The Bible's good with slavery argument doesn't really pass the test. And now we come to Exodus 21:20, a verse so morally bankrupt it could default an entire theology. This is the kind of scripture apologists like Alan Parr wish had been quietly redacted during a divine editorial session. Instead, it sits there in the open, waving a big flag that says, God-sanctioned violence, terms and conditions apply. The verse plainly states that if a slave owner beats a slave and they die immediately, there must be punishment. But if the slave lingers for a day or two and then dies or survives, no punishment is necessary because, quote, the slave is his property. That's not divine tolerance. That's divine endorsement of delayed death as a legal loophole. Alan wants you to see this as God delicately navigating a messy world, maybe even trying to put guardrails on the brutality of ancient culture. He's hoping you read this and think, see, at least there were rules. But if your moral defense boils down to it could have been worse, you've already admitted it isn't good. Alan reframes the verse like it's God sighing and saying, okay, you're going to beat people, but let's set some boundaries. That's not holiness. That's HR policy for human trafficking. What the text actually says, in no uncertain terms, is that a slave's life has a monetary value, not an inherent one. The owner's punishment isn't about justice for the victim. It's about financial loss or immediate death creating an inconvenience. If the slave survives long enough, the abuse is effectively considered lawful, because after all, property damage isn't a crime when it's your own. That's the message, that's what's being taught, not love, not mercy, just ownership and timing. So no, this verse isn't some misunderstood ancient cultural artifact. It's a moral dead zone, and no amount of Alan's apologetic gymnastics can make it jump through a hoop of human decency.